Granite County, Montana Territory, August of 1888. The air was a lie. It spoke of endless summer, of warm dust motes dancing in the slanted light of the afternoon, of the gentle hum of insects in the tall prairie grass. But Anya Jensen knew it was a gilded deception, a beautiful mask on the face of a killer. Winter was not a season here. It was a siege, and the preparations began now, or they did not begin at all. She was a widow, a word that felt both too large and too small for what she was. It was a formal title for a state of being that was simply hollow. Lars was gone. A year had passed since the rockfall in the East Mine, a sudden geological sigh that had erased her husband and 2 other men from the world. He had left her with a 30-acre claim of marginal land, a cabin that was little more than a sturdy box against the wind, a 6-year-old son named Eric, and a small chest of books and journals filled with a language few in the territory spoke and ideas even fewer would understand. Her world had shrunk to the space between that cabin and the small, sturdy barn 100 feet away. In that barn lived the entirety of her future. A single milk cow, Bess, whose placid brown eyes held the promise of butter and cheese. 2 goats, whose belligerent personalities were forgiven for the milk they gave, and a half-dozen chickens that were less livestock and more a clucking, feathered horde of tiny, precious engines that turned grain into protein. These animals were not property. They were her partners in a desperate enterprise of survival. The previous winter had been a near catastrophe. A blizzard had descended without warning, a white fury that lasted 4 days. The 100 feet between the cabin and the barn had become an Arctic wasteland, a journey of life and death undertaken multiple times a day. The wind had been a physical force, a wall of knives that sought any sliver of exposed skin. She had stretched a rope between the 2 buildings, and her trips, bundled so heavily she could barely move, were a slow, blind crawl along that lifeline. Bess had caught a lung fever, her breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds for weeks. Anya had nursed the cow with warm mashes and blankets, sleeping in the freezing barn, her own breath crystallizing in the air. The cow had survived. Anya knew, with the cold certainty that now lived in her bones, that they would not be so lucky a second time. The problem was not simply the journey, it was the inefficiency of their existence. The cabin was a constant battle for warmth. The cast-iron stove was a ravenous beast, devouring the wood she and Eric spent their summers collecting. Heat, she knew from watching the smoke curl from the chimney, was an ephemeral guest. It rose, lingered for a moment, and then fled into the vast frozen sky. The barn was even worse. It was a shell that blocked the wind, but held the cold in its very timbers. Every bucket of water she hauled had to be broken from the ice in the creek, and within an hour in the barn, a new skin of ice would be forming on its surface. She was living a life of frantic, repetitive motion, a constant bailing of a boat that was destined to sink. One evening in late August, as Eric slept and the deceptive warmth of the day bled into a cool, clear night, Anya opened Lars's old wooden chest. It smelled of pine and ink and him. She ran her fingers over the leather-bound journals, his neat, angular Danish script filling the pages. He had not been just a miner who knew how to handle dynamite. He was a student of the earth, of pressures and fissures, of ventilation and the strange, steady temperament of the deep rock. He wrote of the mines not as tombs, but as living things, with air that breathed through shafts and a constant, unwavering temperature once you descended past the reach of the sun and frost. She found the page she had been searching for. It was not a memory of his work, but a dream for their future. A sketch of a house, half dug into the side of a hill. Below it were diagrams of airflow, of channels cut into the earth. He had written a note in the margin. Jorden glimmer ikke sommeren, the Danish read. The earth does not forget the summer. He believed the ground itself was a reservoir of warmth, a vast, slow battery that stored the heat of August and bled it back into the world in the depths of January. The conventional wisdom was to build up, to raise a fortress of logs against the sky. Lars's vision was to go down, to seek shelter not on the earth, but in it. A new idea began to form in her mind, an idea so radical, so contrary to the logic of her neighbors, that it felt like a madness. It was not just about surviving the journey to the barn. It was about changing the very nature of her homestead. It was about connecting the two small islands of warmth, the cabin with its stove, the barn with its living, breathing animals, and making them part of a single, unified system. She would dig a tunnel. Not just a shallow trench, but a deep, covered passage, 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, connecting the root cellar of her cabin directly to the foundation of the barn. She would line it with the flat stones she and Eric cleared from the pasture, and she would cover it with a thick layer of sod and earth, creating a seamless, insulated artery between her two worlds. It was a monumental undertaking, a task that would consume every hour of daylight she had before the first snow. It was, she suspected, what her neighbors would call Anya's folly. She was not wrong. The work began the next morning. She marked out the line with stakes and twine. The ground was hard-packed clay, studded with rocks that ranged from the size of a fist to the size of a skull. The digging was brutal, unforgiving labor. Each shovelful was a negotiation with the stubborn earth. Eric, too small to dig, was put in charge of hauling the smaller rocks away in his little wagon. By the end of the first week, she had cleared a trench barely 20 feet long and only 3 feet deep. Her hands were a geography of blisters and cuts. Her back was a constant, screaming ache. Her neighbors noticed. At first, it was with curiosity. Mr. Hemlock, who ran the small mill, stopped his wagon. "Putting in a new root cellar, Mrs. Jensen?" he asked, his voice friendly enough. "I am connecting it to the barn," she replied, not looking up from her work, her shovel striking a rock with a jarring clang. Hemlock paused. "Connecting it? For what purpose?" "To walk," she said simply, "and for the air." He stared at the long line of twine stretching across the yard, at the pitiful progress she had made. He chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. "A man could build a whole cabin in the time it'll take you to dig that ditch, ma'am. A simple rope line is all you need for the snow." He shook his head, flicked the reins, and drove on. The story of the mad widow and her ditch began to circulate. The mockery was quiet at first, couched in feigned concern. But as the weeks wore on and the trench deepened, as she began the painstaking work of lining the bottom and sides with flat stones, the whispers grew louder. They called it the widow's trench, then Anya's folly. She was wasting the last precious weeks of good weather on a project that was, at best, a bizarre luxury, and at worst, a fatal distraction from the real work of survival: chopping wood, mending the roof, hunting for winter meat. She was seen not just as eccentric, but as a poor, foolish woman squandering her chance to endure. The voice of convention arrived in the form of Silas Croft. He was the most successful rancher in the valley, a man whose opinion was treated as gospel. He was tall and broad, with a face weathered into a permanent mask of stern pragmatism. He had built his homestead with his own 2 hands, and he believed in the proven ways: thick walls, a tall stone chimney, and a woodpile the size of a small house. He saw Anya's project not just as foolish, but as an affront to common sense, a dangerous delusion that might well leave her and her boy to freeze. He rode over one afternoon in late September. The aspens on the hills were a blaze of gold, a final, beautiful warning. Anya was deep in the trench, now nearly 100 feet long and almost at the barn's foundation. She was levering a large rock into place with a long iron bar, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Mistress Jensen," Croft said, his voice booming down into the trench. He did not dismount from his horse, a subtle assertion of his status and the triviality of her labor. Anya shielded her eyes from the sun and looked up at his imposing silhouette. "Mr. Croft." "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," he began, his tone that of a man delivering a verdict. "You are engaged in a great and terrible folly. You are spending your strength and your time digging a grave when you should be stacking wood. The community is concerned. I am concerned. A widow and her child have a claim on our charity, but we cannot help those who will not help themselves in a practical manner." Anya straightened up, leaning on the iron bar. She felt a flicker of anger, but it was quickly subsumed by a vast, weary patience. She had heard these arguments in the whispers of others. To hear them now, delivered as a formal proclamation, changed nothing. "I have enough wood, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. "This is also winter work." Croft scoffed. This? This is a hole in the ground. It is unnatural. It will fill with snow, it will collapse, it will draw damp and sickness into your home. A house is meant to stand in the sun, not burrow like a badger. I am advising you, for the sake of your boy, to abandon this project. Fill it in. Spend the last month of good weather on proven preparations. Anya looked away from him, down at the cool, dark earth she had shaped with her own hands. She ran her palm along a large, smooth stone she had set into the wall. It was cool to the touch, a deep and patient cold. She thought of Lars's journals, of his careful diagrams of thermodynamics. He had written about the folly of the open fireplace, a design that heated a room by sucking all its warm air up the chimney, creating drafts that made the rest of the house colder. He called it making the sky warm while your feet freeze. Her tunnel was the opposite of that. It was an argument against waste. She looked back up at Silas Croft, at the certainty etched on his face. "The cold is not just in the wind, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It is in the ground. But so is the warmth. A sink can also be a source." He stared at her, utterly baffled by her cryptic words. He saw not a woman with a plan, but a mind unmoored by grief. He saw a liability. "You are making a mistake that will cost you dearly," he said, his voice now cold and final. He turned his horse and rode away, the matter closed in his mind. He had offered sound advice. It had been refused. The consequences were now her own. Anya watched him go. Then she picked up her shovel and went back to work. The work was a race against the sky. As October deepened, the days grew shorter, the nights colder. The first hard frost came, silvering the grass and hardening the top layer of earth each morning. She finished the stone lining, a dry-stacked wall of carefully chosen rocks, creating a sturdy 5-foot-high passage. Then came the roof. She laid thick timbers across the top, salvaged from an old collapsed shed on the property. On top of the timbers, she layered hides she had traded for, creating a waterproof membrane. And then, day by day, shovelful by shovelful, she and Eric began to return the earth, piling it high over the roof of the tunnel until it formed a long, low mound, like the spine of some sleeping subterranean creature. She seeded it with prairie grass, and by the first snowfall, it had all but vanished, a gentle swell in the land between her cabin and her barn. She had finished. The narrative must now pause, as Anya's work did. To understand what she had built, you cannot look at it with the eyes of Silas Croft, who saw only a hole in the ground. You must look at it with the mind of Lars Jensen, the mind of an engineer who understood that survival was not about brute force, but about physics. What Anya had built was not a tunnel. It was an engine, a passive geothermal heat exchanger. The first principle was the simplest: insulation. A conventional log cabin, even one built by a master like Silas Croft, is a thermal sieve. Wood is a relatively poor insulator. A solid 12-inch log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 15. The packed earth and sod Anya had piled on top of her tunnel was over 2 feet thick. Its R value was closer to 50. But the true genius of the system lay not in the roof, but in the floor and walls. They were simply the earth itself, the vast, stable mass of the planet. And the earth operates by a different set of rules. This is the second principle: geothermal stability. The surface of the earth freezes and bakes with the seasons, but go down just a few feet below the frost line, and the temperature remains remarkably constant year-round. In that part of Montana, the deep earth holds a steady temperature of about 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It is never warm, but more importantly, it is never fatally cold. Silas Croft's cabin floor, built on frozen ground, would leach heat from anyone standing on it. The floor of Anya's tunnel was a constant, predictable 45 degrees. Air entering that tunnel would not be warmed precisely. Rather, it would be prevented from becoming colder. It was a place where the brutal, sub-zero temperatures of a Montana winter simply could not reach. The third and most elegant principle was that of thermal mass and convection. The stone-lined walls of the tunnel were not just for structural support. They were a thermal battery. Throughout the day, any excess heat from the sun hitting the cabin, from the stove, and most critically, from the animals themselves, would be absorbed by the immense mass of the stones and the surrounding earth. A single cow produces about 3,000 BTUs of heat per hour, the equivalent of a small space heater. In a drafty barn, this heat is instantly lost. But in Anya's sealed system, it became a resource. The warm, moist air from the animals would be drawn into the tunnel. As it traveled, it would surrender its heat to the cool stone walls, which would store it. The air, now cooler and denser, would continue its slow journey toward the cabin, arriving not as a warm breeze, but as temperate, preconditioned air that was far easier for her small stove to heat to a comfortable level. She had, in effect, made the body heat of her livestock pay rent. She had designed a system that captured waste heat and put it to work. Contrast this with the established wisdom of Silas Croft's home. His massive stone fireplace was the heart of his house, a symbol of warmth and prosperity. It was also a terribly inefficient machine. A traditional fireplace operates by drawing huge volumes of air from the room to feed the fire, and then sending that air, along with almost all of the fire's heat, straight up the chimney. For every log he burned, 90% of its energy was used to warm the Montana sky. This massive updraft created a vacuum in the house, which in turn sucked frigid outside air in through every crack and crevice in the walls. His roaring fire, the very symbol of his battle against the cold, was paradoxically making his house colder and draftier. He was fighting a war of attrition, throwing endless fuel at an enemy he was actively inviting into his home. Anya had chosen a different path. She was not fighting the cold, she was managing it. She had created a closed loop, a system that breathed, that captured and stored energy, that worked in harmony with the natural properties of the earth. Her neighbors saw a woman digging a hole. Anya was building a machine based on forgotten knowledge, a machine with no moving parts, a machine that would be powered by the breath of a cow and the deep, abiding warmth of the earth itself. Her folly was, in fact, an act of profound and quiet genius. All it needed was a test. And the winter of 1888 was about to provide one for the ages. The winter began gently, with a few light snows in November that melted in the afternoon sun. December was cold but clear. The community settled into its winter rhythm. The men hunted, their rifles echoing in the frozen hills. The women baked and mended, their world shrinking to the firelit circle of their cabins. The talk of Anya's folly faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of a dwindling salt supply and the price of furs. Anya, to the outside world, seemed to be living as they were. She was seen chopping wood, hauling water. No one could see the fundamental difference in her existence. No one knew that when she went to the barn, she did not pull on 3 layers of wool and a heavy coat. She simply opened a door in her root cellar, picked up a lantern, and walked. The air in the tunnel was cool, still, and smelled of damp earth and distant hay. The journey took less than a minute. She would emerge in the barn into a space that was chilly, but not dangerously so. The water in the animal's trough would have a thin film of ice on the coldest mornings, but never the solid, bucket-shattering block she had contended with the year before. The animals were calm, their coats thick and healthy. She was saving hours of labor each day, and more importantly, she was saving her own strength, the most precious commodity she possessed. Her woodpile, which her neighbors had deemed dangerously small, was shrinking at a glacial pace. A small fire in the morning to cook and heat the cabin, another in the evening. The rest of the time, the retained heat and the absence of drafts kept the single room at a livable, if not toasty, temperature. The test came in the second week of January. Later, it would be called the Great Blizzard, or the Children's Blizzard, for the speed with which it descended and the school children it caught on their way home across the plains. It began as an unremarkable gray day, cold, but not brutally so. Then, around noon, the sky dropped like a wall. The temperature plummeted not by degrees, but by tens of degrees in a matter of minutes. A low, guttural roar rose from the north, the sound of the wind, a wind that felt less like moving air and more like a solid object, a tidal wave of pure, kinetic cold. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring curtain of ice particles that reduced visibility to zero. For the settlers of Granite County, the world simply ended. Those caught outside had no chance. Those inside became prisoners in their own homes. Inside the large, well-built home of Silas Croft, a battle was underway. The wind hit the north wall of his house with the force of a physical blow, a continuous, screaming assault. A fine powder of snow forced its way through infinitesimal cracks around the window frames, lining the sills with miniature drifts. The main room, with its great stone fireplace, was the command center. His wife and 2 children were huddled there, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Croft himself became a stoker, a servant to the fire. The fireplace, which had always been a source of pride, was now a tyrant. It consumed logs with a terrifying appetite. The heat it produced seemed to reach only a few feet into the room, creating a small bubble of warmth in a sea of biting cold. Beyond that circle, the temperature dropped precipitously. A mug of water left on the far table was frozen solid within an hour. The sound was a torment. The constant shrieking howl of the wind was a psychological weapon, grinding away at their resolve. Every so often, a gust would slam the chimney, forcing a puff of acrid smoke back into the room, making their eyes water. Croft felt the cold seeping through the floorboards, a relentless upward pressure. He had built this house to be a fortress. He had used the best timber, the tightest joinery, and yet the cold was winning. It was an insidious, invading army, and his roaring fire was a futile, desperate defense. On the second day, a new fear began to creep into his mind. The woodpile. He had a massive stock of seasoned hardwood on the sheltered side of the house, but the journey of 20 feet to reach it was now as dangerous as a polar expedition. He made the trip twice, and came back each time gasping for breath, his beard frozen solid, his skin numb and white with frostbite. He knew he could not make the trip many more times. He began to ration the wood, feeding the fire less frequently. The bubble of warmth shrank. The cold advanced. He looked at his children, their faces pale and pinched, and for the first time in his life, Silas Croft, the master of his domain, felt the icy grip of true, helpless fear. He thought of his cattle in the barn, 150 feet away. He might as well have been on the moon. He could not reach them. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that he was losing them. 100 feet. That was the distance that had separated Anya Jensen from her animals. But now, that distance did not exist. Inside her small cabin, the world was quiet. The roar of the wind was a distant, muffled thing. The sound of a faraway beast. There were no drafts. The single flame in her lantern burned straight and true. The air was cool, but it was a still, calm coolness. Not the biting, aggressive cold that plagued the Croft house. Her small stove had a low fire in it, consuming one small log every 2 hours. The cabin was not warm, but it was a uniform temperature throughout. Eric was not huddled by the stove. He was on the floor, playing with the small wooden soldiers his father had carved for him. When it was time to tend the animals, Anya simply put on a shawl, lit her lantern, and opened the door in the floor. She descended the stone steps into her root cellar and then into the mouth of the tunnel. The air here was even calmer, the silence absolute. The lantern light threw flickering shadows on the stone walls as she walked the 100-foot passage. There was no wind, no snow, no cold that bit to the bone. She emerged into the barn to the placid sounds of chewing and the warm, earthy smell of the animals. Bess, the cow, turned her head and blinked slowly. The goats bleated a greeting. The chickens were roosting peacefully. She did her chores with an unhurried efficiency that would have been unthinkable in the storm outside. She milked the cow, fed the animals, and broke the thin layer of ice in the water trough. The animals' own body heat, trapped within the well-sealed barn and the connected tunnel system, kept the space above freezing. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of warmth. She returned to the cabin with a pail of fresh, warm milk. She heated some on the stove for Eric, the simple act a profound luxury in the heart of the blizzard. She was not just surviving, she was living. Her quiet, desperate gamble, her weeks of back-breaking labor, had paid off. Anya's folly was a sanctuary. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the world was reborn into an eerie, blinding silence. The wind was gone. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The land was buried under a thick, sculpted blanket of white. Drifts were piled 10, 15 feet high against buildings. It was a world erased and remade. For Silas Croft, the silence was a relief, but it brought a new kind of dread. His wood was almost gone. The house was frigid. As soon as it was light enough to see, he bundled himself in his remaining dry clothes and fought his way out the door, digging through the drift that had almost completely buried it. His first priority was the barn. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was waist deep, in some places chest deep. Each step was a monumental effort. It took him nearly 30 minutes to cross the 150 feet. The sight inside the barn broke him. The cold had been too much. 3 of his best cattle, the core of his herd, were dead, frozen solid in the positions they had stood. Others were sick, their breathing shallow and ragged. The water troughs were frozen blocks of solid ice. The failure was absolute, and it was his. He, the man of foresight and practical wisdom, had been defeated. His fortress had failed. A grim thought then entered his mind. The widow Jensen. If his large, sturdy ranch had become a tomb, what must have become of her flimsy cabin and her little boy? He had warned her. He had told her she was digging her own grave. Now, a heavy sense of guilt and duty compelled him. He had to check. He had to know. His trek to her homestead was even more arduous. The snow was deeper here, the drifts shaped by the subtle contours of the land. He felt old and brittle, the cold having settled deep into his bones. When he finally reached her small cabin, it was half buried in a drift, a single, thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. He expected to find a tomb of ice. He pounded on the door, his gloved fist making a dull, muffled sound. He was prepared for silence. The door opened. Anya Jensen stood there. She was not wrapped in rags. She wore a simple wool dress. Behind her, he could see her son Eric sitting on the floor, looking healthy and calm. And then he felt it, a wave of air flowing out of the cabin. It was not hot, but it was warm. It was the feeling of life. Croft was speechless. He stared at her, then past her into the impossible calm of the cabin. "How?" he stammered, his own breath pluming in the frigid air. "How did you keep the fire? My wood is gone." "I did not need much wood," Anya said simply. He stepped inside, uninvited, driven by a desperate need to understand. The warmth was real. It was a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the floor itself. The air was still. His eyes fell upon the thick wooden door in the floor that led to her root cellar. He saw the smooth, worn stones of the threshold. He looked at Anya, at her calm, tired face. The memory of her words came back to him. A sink can also be a source. He did not understand, but he knew that he was standing in the presence of a truth his entire life had overlooked. His arrogance, his certainty, his loud proclamations of common sense, they all crumbled into dust in the face of this quiet, impossible warmth. His methods had led to death and failure. Hers, to life and peace. "Show me," he said. His voice was not a command, but a plea. It was the humblest sound he had ever made. Anya nodded. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a shared understanding of the terrible power of the winter they had both just endured. She lit a lantern, opened the cellar door, and led him down. He followed her into the tunnel. He walked its length, the lantern light dancing on the intricate stone walls. He felt the air, cool, but not cold. Still, but not stagnant. He ran his bare hand along the earthen wall and felt the deep, neutral temperature of the earth, a temperature that was a world away from the killing frost on the surface. He saw the genius of it. He saw the physics. He saw it all. When they emerged in the warm, living barn, he finally turned to her. The great Silas Croft, the pillar of the community, looked at the quiet widow he had dismissed as a fool. "Teach me the principle," he said. Anya took him back to the cabin. She went to the small wooden chest that held Lars's legacy. She took out a journal and opened it on the table. She pointed to a diagram of convection loops, of thermal mass, of airflow. She began to explain, her voice quiet and methodical, sharing the knowledge that had been her husband's gift and her own salvation. The skeptic had become the first student. The Jensen passage, as it came to be known, was never again called Anya's folly. That spring, Silas Croft, with Anya as his advisor, dug his own. He connected his house not only to his cattle barn, but to his workshop and his chicken coop. Others followed. The simple, elegant principle of working with the earth instead of fighting it began to spread through the valley. The tunnels were modified and improved, adapted for different terrains and different needs. But the core idea remained. The earth does not forget the summer. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of a terrible winter, a lesson brought to them by an outsider, a woman who had listened to the quiet wisdom in her husband's journals instead of the loud certainties of the world. Anya Jensen lived a long life on that homestead. She never remarried, finding a quiet sufficiency in her land, her son, and the deep respect of the community she had inadvertently taught how to survive. She became a quiet pillar, a woman people sought out not for gossip, but for advice on the temperament of the soil, the flow of water, and the secrets of staying warm. Years later, long after she was gone, her son Eric found a passage she had underlined in one of Lars's journals. It seemed to summarize the entirety of her philosophy, the quiet truth she had unearthed with a shovel and her own 2 hands. "Men see the fire and think it is the source of life," Lars had written. "They are wrong. The fire is a frantic, temporary gift. The earth is the source. It does not give its warmth freely, but it holds it forever. We must not fight the cold. We must bargain with the heat that is already there." This story is a historically inspired reconstruction of events that celebrate the ingenuity of pioneers. The characters are fictional, and their actions are dramatized for effect. The content presented here does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. It is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. And now, as we close this chapter, I have a question for you. What deep, quiet wisdom have you been told is folly? What tunnel are you being called to dig, not in the ground, but in your own life? The world will tell you to chop more wood, to feed the frantic, roaring fire of convention. Perhaps instead, you need to listen to the earth.